Hello, BookTube, and welcome to OcTolkien, a month-long celebration of the writings of J.R.R. Tolkien. It's being conducted here on BookTube by Justin at Ghost Reader and by James Chatham and by yours truly, in which each of us, we divvy up the works of the master and talk about them. And for me, I'm doing the Silmarillion, which is Tolkien's great Bible of his legendarium. This is a meta-narrative, a much larger narrative, the epic past history, the mytho-history of all of the events that take place in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, which was covered by Lukas over his channel last year, wonderfully. And I mentioned last time when I mentioned that I was doing this, that I would link to all of his videos, and I will link to those again. They're well worth your time. My discussion of Silmarillion over the next 3 or 4 weeks will be an addendum to that. It will be a fleshing out of my own thoughts on the subject, in case you're noticing the snazzy background here in the room. I had some muscular teenagers over to fix that wall right there, to pull the bookcase out from the corner and make it so that everything is visible. And that, of course, required moving books around, which was lots of fun, and which I will continue to do. I don't need the boys for that. In fact, they'd get in the way, since they barely know how to read. But anyway, I chose for my part, for OcTolkien, to do the Silmarillion. And this time around, this discussion is the first 2 chunks of the Silmarillion, the Ainulindale and the Valaquenta. And those are the stories of the gods of Tolkien's mythology, of his legendarium. Not the supernatural beings that like elves or dwarfs, but the actual gods, the beings that come from far away from the earth, that have their birth before the beginning of time, and that can create things, not just physical things like rings of power, but trees, life forms, that sort of thing. They are an entirely different order of being. We never meet any of them in The Lord of the Rings. We never meet any of them in The Hobbit. We only meet one of them very briefly in one of the unfinished tales. But we're told in the course of these first 2 books that the knowledge that we know any of this at all comes from the fact that it was told by those godlike beings to the Eldar, to a race of elves who then communicated it forward in time. Otherwise, none of the inhabitants of Middle-earth would know any of this. This is the story of the very beginning that Tolkien chooses to give his legendarium, and that very beginning is an omnipotent deity who creates things. He himself is Eru Ilúvatar, and he is not created. When the story begins, he is already there. And he uses song, a mighty song, to create everything else. And introduces mighty themes and variations that will eventually create the world that is called Arda, and the chunk of the world that will then become Middle-earth and all the inhabitants thereof. And this presents problems, of course. Tolkien, when it came time for him to make a creation story, really couldn't do otherwise, I guess, than give us a mirror image of the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is also birthed from the mind and imagination of one singular male deity, one singular omnipotent male deity that gives rise to everything else, all the other supernatural beings and everything that's not supernatural that follows. I'm not quite sure, no matter how many times I reread the Silmarillion, I'm not quite sure why Tolkien thought that he had no option other than that. This was a professor who was extremely familiar with Norse mythology, for instance, which doesn't do that. And is every bit as compelling and echoes very strongly throughout the legendarium of Tolkien. So I don't know why he thought he needed Eru Ilúvatar. But one way or another, there's Eru Ilúvatar, and then there are the Valar. And they are his children, his sub-gods. Not quite saints compared to God in the Christian universe, but rather think if the Christian God had 12 Jesuses, sort of smaller, but it's still incredibly powerful avatars of himself. And they have all sorts of different personalities depending on the realms of their expertise. There's one who will become associated with and enamored of the oceans of Arda. There's another who is basically the character Vulcan. He's basically a smithy god. And right from the beginning, in another direct echo of Christian mythology, the most powerful of the Valar is also the one who turns evil. The Lucifer figure is Melkor, who at the beginning of the story, these two brief books that we deal with, we are told that there is a great music, that there was Eru, the One, who in Arda is called Ilúvatar, and he made first the Ainur, the Holy Ones, who were the offspring of his thought, and they were with him before aught else was made. And once they're all assembled, Eru and the Valar, the composition of music begins. The great themes of Ilúvatar begin. And right away we get problems of the type that people have been associating with, for instance, the Judeo-Christian God, since that God existed. Let me read you a passage here. It's lovely prose, so you won't mind hearing it. Eru Ilúvatar has introduced a theme, and unexpectedly, in the hosts of the Valar, Melkor has introduced a counter theme, born of envy and the desire to create things. It turns out that some of the Valar, not just Melkor, have a desire of their own to create things, when apparently that is supposed to be the sole province of Eru Ilúvatar. A little bit unclear to me why that would be a trespass, but one way or another, over this passage, a kind of contest of music erupts around the throne of Eru Ilúvatar. He has a throne. He's a king. He has a corporeal body. We know that he has a face. We know that he has hands. It's a wholesale importation of a lot of the problems associated with the creator-born mytho-history of Christianity. In a weird way, this is an author who usually doesn't let things like this pass by unnoticed, and yet, as I will argue, it serves no good purpose. But anyway, then Ilúvatar arose, and the Ainur perceived that he smiled. And he lifted up his left hand, and a new theme began amid the storm, like and yet unlike to the former theme, and it gathered power and had new beauty. But the discord of Melkor rose in uproar and contended with it, and again there was a war of sound more violent than before, until many of the Ainur were dismayed and sang no longer, and Melkor had the mastery. Then again Ilúvatar arose, and the Ainur perceived that his countenance was stern. And he lifted up his right hand, and behold, a third theme grew amid the confusion, and it was unlike the others. For it seemed at first soft and sweet, a mere rippling of sounds in delicate melodies. But it could not be quenched, and it took to itself power and profundity. And it seemed at last that there were two musics progressing at one time before the seat of Ilúvatar, and they were utterly at variance. The one was deep and wide and beautiful, but slow and blended with immeasurable sorrow, from which its beauty chiefly came. The other had now achieved a unity of its own, but it was loud and vain and endlessly repeated, and it had little harmony, but rather a clamorous unison of many trumpets braying upon a few notes. And it essayed to drown the other music by violence of its voice, but it seemed that its most triumphant notes were taken by the other and woven into its own sound pattern. In the midst of this strife, whereat the halls of Ilúvatar shook and the tremor ran out through the silences yet unmoved, Ilúvatar arose a third time, and his face was terrible to behold. Then he raised up both his hands, and in one chord, deeper than the abyss, higher than the firmament, piercing as the light in the eye of Ilúvatar, the music ceased. Then Ilúvatar spoke, and he said, Mighty are the Ainur, and mightiest among them is Melkor. But that he may know, and all the Ainur, that I am Ilúvatar, those things that ye have sung, I will show them forth, that ye may see what ye have done. And thou, Melkor, shalt see that no theme may be played that hath not its uttermost source in me. Nor can any alter the music in my despite. For he that attempteth that this shall prove but mine instrument, in the devising of things more wonderful, which he himself hath not imagined. And there you see the problem. Ilúvatar is lying. The very first words we get in the Silmarillion are self-evident lies. The description that we have just been told of these conflicting musics around the throne of Ilúvatar show clearly that Ilúvatar did not anticipate what was happening. We are carefully told that his countenance changes from happiness to sternness to rage, and eventually calls a halt to the whole thing, orders it to silence. These are not the actions of someone whose plan is unfolding exactly as he anticipated. And that happens in Christian mytho-history as well, where Christians have to square the circle of a God who is omniscient and knows everything about what's coming in the future with a God who's perpetually disappointed and outraged by the way things turn out. There's no way to do it. And I don't know why Tolkien sets up that problem. I don't understand why he didn't take a seat, just sit back in his chair and realize that his entire legendarium works just fine without an omnipotent, all-knowing, all-powerful, single, male, head king god. Even if you just take him away, take Eru Ilúvatar away, and just have the Valar, the system works much better. Then you have at least a grounds for conflict. And we get conflict. In the Valaquenta, we get the story of how when Eru Ilúvatar takes the Valar out into the void, into the great vastness of the unformed universe, he shows them what it is that their music created. Their music created a world, Arda. And it is still largely unformed, or gradually forming. They are going to have to do the work of making it realize the beauty and the variety of their music. They are going to have to build its oceans and its mountains, and eventually people it. And in the course of their doing that, they are opposed at every turn by Melkor, who is envious not only now of the supremacy of the Ilúvatar in being able to make things, but also the innovation and the purity of his brethren Valar in being able to perfect those things. He's enraged with envy and malice, and he's constantly thwarting them in their designs, which is a kind of high metaphorical attempt on Tolkien's part to describe the tumultuous seismic and volcanic beginnings of the world. There are no living beings on Arda at this time. This is just wars of the gods, wars and efforts of the gods. But it gradually becomes clear to the Valar that the themes of Ilúvatar involve the coming of races on Arda. The firstborn, who will be the elves, and the secondborn, who will be the men. But at times in the Valaquenta, it seems almost like a Grand Central Station's worth of beings arrive before the elves do. The elves have their title of firstborn through technicalities only. The smithy god, for instance, creates a race of smithy beings, the dwarves, and he awakens them. And then he is informed by Ilúvatar that that is against the plan of Ilúvatar. The firstborn is supposed to wake up first, and the smithy god, unlike Melkor, is repentant and takes up his great hammer to destroy his creations that cower in fear when they see their fate. And when Ilúvatar sees that the smithy god is perfectly willing to destroy his handiwork out of respect for this one tyrannical king god, he says, no, just put them to sleep, and they can wake up after. So the first beings, the first created non-supernatural beings to awaken anywhere on Arda are the dwarves, not the elves or the men. But also the world spirit goddess of the Valar invokes spirits from the outer realm to inhabit the trees. The Ents, basically, are also at least foreshadowed, if not called into being before the elves wake up. And in addition to that, in addition to the Valar moving into the world of Arda and beginning to order it according to their will, there are also secondary spirits who come as well. The Maiar, who are much like the Valar in that they can walk unclothed, as Tolkien puts it. They are energy beings. They can take on physical forms, and those physical forms can be infinite in variety, but they aren't as powerful as the Valar. They are immortal. They are energy beings. They are not earthly creatures at all. They have a wisdom and an understanding that goes all the way back to the beginning of creation. But they are deeply involved in the world of Arda, and we're told we're told the names of many of the Maiar, but we're told too, in particular, that we will encounter, and it's mind-boggling to think one of the Valar is a being who will be known eventually as Sauron, the Lord of the Rings. And another of the Valar is Olorin, who is identified only by that name in these two books that we're reading, but who will become Gandalf. Which it's kind of amazing to think that great vying of two personalities is set so far in the past of Tolkien's imagining. It's kind of amazing and kind of fun, but I should point out Of course, I want to know your opinions if you read along. But I want to point out, for those of you who aren't reading along, that there's precious little fun in these first 2 books. We want more than this from our stories, right? We want more than vague generalities and a Yahweh-type God ordering people around and lying about it. We want conflict. We want heroism. We want a, dramatic narrative. And that is coming in bucket loads. That is coming in bucket loads. It's not here in these first 2. Once again, an odd opening on Tolkien's part. And also a strange not only because it doesn't have any dramatic tension, but also because it doesn't have any relevance to Tolkien's later world at all, even in the Silmarillion. But let's leave the Silmarillion aside for the minute and talk about The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. In The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, there are no religious people at all. There's no such thing as religious ceremonies, as religious rites or rituals, nothing like that. The closest we come is Mad Denethor, when he is insane, when he has been driven insane by contact with the Palantir and also by his grief and sense of frustration. He decides to burn Faramir alive in The Lord of the Rings. At one of the concluding moments, one of the dramatic high points of The Lord of the Rings, he decides to burn his own son alive. And when he decides to do that, he says, "We will do a burnt sacrifice like the pagans of old did." A weird and I think a lazy toss-off phrase on Tolkien's part that indicates that maybe once upon a time there were bloodthirsty religious rituals, and who knows what the Haradrim do in the East. But one way or another, it's not just the humans, like Boromir or Aragorn, who do not worship, period. Worship the idea of the supernatural that is utterly beyond the world, as opposed to the supernatural they can reach out and touch, like the elves or the dwarves or something like that. The idea of a supernatural that guides their world and hears their prayers is utterly unknown. And it's not just the humans. The elves also. They know of the Valar. They long to return to the West when their time in Middle-earth is done, but they don't worship at all. Including, they also don't worship Gandalf. We have to assume that some of the elves are old enough to know what Gandalf is. We're told in the Valaquenta that Olorin often walked among, that he loved the elves, and that he often walked among them as an elf, unbeknownst to them, encouraging them and filling their minds with hope and imagination. So he's been with the elves for a very long time. We have to assume that some of the older of the elves, Erest or Glorfindel or Galadriel, know what Gandalf is, that they know that he is not just some wizard. They have to know that as far as they're concerned, he's an angel. He's a direct emissary from beings who gave them birth, but they don't worship him at all. So I'm kind of a loss to understand. I'm kind of a loss to understand why any of this is needed. The heroic stories that we are about to read next, starting next weekend, yes, absolutely, that I see. But this beginning, gods ordering the world as they see fit, and creating life forms, which is just fine for the elves. We will be told that the elves, the firstborn, are created immortal, beautiful and immortal. They once they reach adulthood, they never change. They don't age. They can grow weary. They can be hollowed out with toil or with disappointment. But they only, when they die, their spirits go to the west, to the halls of Mandos. But while they're on Middle Earth, they live uninterrupted youth. Whereas men are different. Men age and die. Okay, fine. But if you have created life forms, then you are removing the concept of evolution from the table. You're removing the concept of adaptation in any way. And it shows, because although the elves are immutable, men can change over generations, but they can only get worse. They can't get any better. They can only get worse. They can only decrease in size or strength or insight or longevity, except for occasional genetic throwbacks where those characters who are old enough to know better will say, yes, the blood of Numenor runs true in him. It looks as if time has not passed. But that's a kind of a deterministic view of the world. But it nevertheless is necessary. It flows from the mythology that we read this week, which is that this is not a world that came into being. This is a world that was made. And these are life forms that were made. But anyway, when we finish these two, we will then move on. Next week, we will be reading actual stories. Let me see here. We'll be reading the first half of the Quenta Silmarillia. So let's see here. We will be reading to chapter 12, which is of men, and that includes quite a bit. That includes quite a bit of pleasing high drama, still mostly involving gods and sub-gods, but you'll see there's a lot of the problem with drama involving gods and sub-gods is that there isn't much that's at stake, and that's also a problem with elves if they live forever. But Tolkien knows exactly what he's doing once he gets on that kind of faux epic ground. It's only this beginning that I'd be curious to know, especially those of you who are reading this for the first time, what did you make of this beginning? I mean, it's beautifully done. It's beautifully epic prose, but I could see why it threw off so many critics who originally encountered it, and it's always thrown me off. I would like it if the Silmarillion started with the Quenta Silmarillia and just referred to these beings in flashback or in part or in fragments. We're told that the Valar conveyed these stories to the West, getting them straight. That the Eldar, one of the oldest races of elves, conveyed these stories to the West straight from the Valar, from the mouths of the gods themselves. But reading this in a meta fashion, I'm not 100% sure that the Eldar wouldn't lie about that. One way or another, we don't know, because it's not like these gods ever manifest themselves. It's not like Aragorn ever gets a visit from Manwë or Allura. We don't. The closest we get are supernatural beings that live in the world and can die in the world. But one way or another, that's it for this. After this, there's high mythology mixed in with the first 12 chapters of the Quenta Silmarillia, but there's also far more human passions, and we'll reconvene next week and talk all about that. So in the meantime, I will say goodbye for now, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.